Picture this. A small team of geologists is standing 2.5 kilometers below the surface of the Canadian Shield, in a mine shaft so deep that the rock walls are warm to the touch and the air tastes of iron and salt. They are pumping water out of a sealed crack in the stone. The water comes out cloudy, slightly bubbling, faintly orange, and saltier than the ocean. They send a sample to a laboratory at the University of Toronto. The results come back and they don't believe them. So they test it again and again, and the answer never changes. The water in their hands has been trapped underground for more than 2 billion years. It is older than the first complex life on Earth. It is older than the breathable oxygen in our atmosphere. It is older than almost anything you can name on this planet. And it is not sterile. There are living organisms inside it. Microbes that survive without sunlight, without plants, without oxygen, feeding on chemistry alone, on hydrogen and sulfate slowly leaking out of cracked rock. They have been alive in that water since long before our most distant ancestors crawled out of the sea. This is not science fiction. This is not a story from another planet. This happened inside an active Canadian mine, and almost nobody outside the industry knows about it. The story of how Canada's oldest mines were sunk, how they went deeper than anyone ever planned, and what is being pulled out of the bottom of those shafts right now is one of the strangest, most consequential, and least told stories in this country's history. We are about to climb down into it together, from the very first shafts under the Atlantic, to the silver rush, to the gold camps of the North, to the nickel basin that fed 2 world wars, and finally to the deepest holes ever dug in this hemisphere, and to what those holes are giving back to the world. Before we head any deeper, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. This channel digs into the corners of Canadian history that the textbooks ignored, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Smash a like on the video, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and then let us climb down into the shaft together. Canada's relationship with the underground did not start in a gold camp or a uranium boom. It started in the coal seams of Nova Scotia, in the long black fingers of rock that reach outward under the Atlantic Ocean from Cape Breton Island. As early as 1720, French soldiers were chipping at exposed seams at Cow Bay, near the modern village of Port Morien, to keep the fires burning inside the fortress of Louisbourg. Those were not really mines. They were shallow scoops in a cliff face, the kind of work a strong man could do with a pick and a barrow. The real Canadian underground story begins in the early 1800s, when the General Mining Association, a London company holding a monopoly granted by the British Crown, started sinking proper shafts in Pictou County, on the mainland and on Cape Breton itself. By the 1830s, Nova Scotia coal was moving by sailing ship to Boston and Halifax and St. John, and the first generation of Canadian deep mine engineers was learning the trade beneath the seabed. This was harder and stranger than most people today realize. The coal seams under Cape Breton run outward beneath the ocean for kilometers. The miners walked every shift down sloping tunnels that took them far out to sea with hundreds of meters of cold, salt water pressing down above their heads. They felt the storms. When the Atlantic was angry, the timbers groaned. Water dripped in salty trickles through the roof, and sometimes the rock gave way and the sea came through. The Spring Hill Mining District, opened in 1873 on the mainland, became a name that every Canadian child of a certain generation would eventually learn, because it would become the site of 3 catastrophic disasters between 1891 and 1958. But before any of that violence, the towns of Spring Hill, Stellarton, Westville, Glace Bay, and Sydney Mines were where Canada learned the basic vocabulary of going deep: ventilation, methane, fire damp, choke damp, pillar and stall, longwall mining, the Davy lamp and its successors, cable hoists and steam pumps, drainage galleries, Every concept and every piece of equipment that would later sink the gold and nickel shafts of northern Ontario was first tested here, in the salt-soaked dark beneath the maritime sea floor. By 1900, Cape Breton alone was producing more than 3 million tons of coal per year, and Nova Scotians were among the most skilled deep miners in the British Empire. When the rest of Canada needed people who knew how to dig downward, it called them. The next chapter opened almost by accident, 1,500 kilometers to the west, where the rocks of the Canadian Shield rolled up out of the boreal forest in a ring of greenstone and granite. In 1883, the Canadian Pacific Railway was being blasted through the bush, north of Lake Huron. A blacksmith named Tom Flanagan, working on the line near a small siding called Sudbury Junction, noticed that one particular outcrop, freshly broken by dynamite, glittered strangely in the sun. A few weeks later, a railway worker named Thomas Froude and a young man named Ronaldo McConnell took samples from a nearby ridge and had them assayed. The samples came back rich in nickel and copper. Within a year, prospectors were flooding into the area. The discovery that started in a railway cut would eventually become the Sudbury Basin, the most productive nickel and copper mining district on the planet, and the geological setting of some of the deepest holes ever dug by human beings. But that part of the story would take another half-century to fully unfold. In the 1880s and 1890s, Sudbury was still a frontier camp, and the men working its first surface pits were learning that the ore beneath their feet was unusually difficult. Sudbury nickel was bound up with copper in a complex sulfide ore, and the early smelters could not separate it cleanly. Roasting beds outside the town poured sulfur dioxide into the air for decades, turning the surrounding bush into a barren black wasteland that astronauts in the 1970s would mistake for a lunar landscape. The Apollo program would even use that ravaged ground for training, because it looked enough like the moon to serve as a stand-in. While Sudbury chewed at its strange nickel ore, the men who would change Canada's underground forever were drifting through the bush, looking for something easier to spot, easier to assay, and easier to sell. They were looking for silver and gold. And in the summer of 1903, on a hot August afternoon, on the shore of a quiet lake, about 100 kilometers south of the future Kirkland Lake camp, one of them found what he was looking for. His name was Fred LaRose. He was a blacksmith working on the new Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, the provincial line that was being driven north to open up the clay belt for settlement. According to the legend, which the man himself confirmed in later years with only modest embellishment, LaRose was annoyed at a fox that had been hanging around his forge. He threw his hammer at the animal. The hammer missed the fox and struck an outcrop of rock, knocking off a chip and exposing a vein of native silver so rich it could be pried out in metallic flakes with a pocket knife. LaRose, who was a working tradesman and not a trained prospector, did the sensible thing. He told his employers and his friends. Within months, the bush around Long Lake, which was promptly renamed Cobalt Lake, was crawling with men. By 1905, the town of Cobalt had 10,000 residents, hotels, 3 newspapers, and a stock exchange. It would within a few short years become the richest silver camp in North America. The silver was so pure and so close to the surface that, at first, miners simply walked the outcrops with hammers and pried out leaf silver in great curling flakes. One specimen, displayed in Toronto, was a single sheet weighing more than 7 kilograms. Another was a slab of nearly solid silver, more than a meter across, broken out of the ground by hand. The legends from those first 2 seasons are nearly impossible to believe. A man could find a vein in the morning, sell a claim in the afternoon, and be rich by sundown. Many were. Many also lost everything by the following spring, because Cobalt was a stock promoter's paradise as much as a mining camp, and for every legitimate find, there were 10 paper companies based on a single panicked assay and a hopeful map. But beyond the legends, Beyond the millionaires made and the families ruined, Cobalt did something for Canada that no other camp had done before. It became a school. Within 5 years of Larose throwing his hammer, the small town between the lakes was the densest concentration of practical mining knowledge in the country. Men came up from Nova Scotia bringing their coal mining expertise. Men came from Michigan bringing the techniques of the copper country. Men came from Cornwall in England, generation after generation of hard rock miners with 1,000 years of underground tradition in their blood. They came from Bohemia, from northern Italy, from Sweden, from Finland, from Croatia, from every country in Europe that had an underground tradition. They worked alongside Quebec, lumbermen and Irish farm boys, and French-Canadian river drivers, and men from the Ojibwe and Cree communities who had been on the land since long before any of them. They mixed, they argued, they learned each other's tricks. They figured out between 1903 and 1910 how to sink a shaft in the Canadian Shield in cold weather, how to ventilate a deep working in a country where the rock above your head might be at minus 30 degrees, while the rock below you was already warming, how to dewater a pit in spring breakup, how to lay track underground, how to time blasts, how to recognize the geology that meant you were heading into ore, and the geology that meant you were wasting your time. A young metallurgist working for the Mond Nickel Company up in Sudbury later remembered that in those years before the First World War, you could not walk into a hotel bar in Cobalt without overhearing some new method, some practical innovation, some piece of equipment being argued over. The mining engineer Walter Segsworth, who would later go on to senior positions across the country, said simply that Cobalt was the place where Canada learned to mine. He meant it both literally and as a matter of pride. The expertise that would soon drive shafts deeper than anyone had dreamed in this country was being assembled, almost without anyone outside the industry realizing it, in that one small town between the two lakes. The cobalt silver itself was running in narrow vertical veins, and to follow it, miners had to go down. The first shafts were shallow, only 20 or 30 meters. By 1908, several were down to 300 meters. By 1912, the deepest at the Nipissing and the Coniagas were down to more than 450 meters. These were small numbers by world standards. The Witwatersrand gold mines of South Africa were already past 2,000 meters, but for Canada at that time these were extraordinary depths, and they were being achieved with equipment that was largely improvised, in a climate where the surface infrastructure froze solid for 5 months a year. The men learned to deal with permafrost above and rising heat below. They learned to handle the strange seasonal water tables of the Shield, the way meltwater would surge into shallow workings every May. They learned that the rock of the Canadian Shield was beautifully strong, almost flawless in places, capable of holding open enormous chambers without much support, but that when it failed suddenly and violently. Rock bursts, the sudden explosive failure of a wall or a roof in deep ground under high stress, became a known hazard at Cobalt long before they became famous in the deeper camps to the north. Men were killed by the rock itself, leaping out at them. And then, around 1909, just as the cobalt boom was approaching its peak, the prospectors began to drift further north into country that almost no European had ever crossed. They followed rumors, freighters' tales, and the simple geological logic that the same rocks that hosted silver and cobalt should host other metals further along the same volcanic belt. In the summer of 1909, 4 such men, working in different parties, made discoveries within a few weeks of each other that would change Canada permanently. Their names were Benny Hollinger, Sandy McIntyre, Jack Wilson, and Harry Preston. The country they were prospecting in was the Porcupine, named for a small lake to which it was easier to walk than to spell. None of these men knew, when they sank their first picks into the moss, that they were standing over what would become, dollar for dollar, the greatest gold camp in the entire British Empire. Benny Hollinger was a 24-year-old former barber from Mattawa, a wiry, hard-drinking man with a hard-luck reputation. He had been grub-staked by a cobalt jeweler named Jack McMahon, who handed him $145 and told him to come back with something useful. In late September, Hollinger and his partner, a young Pole named Alex Gillies, were walking a ridge near what is now the city of Timmins, when Hollinger, in frustration at not finding anything, pulled up a clump of moss and threw it aside. Underneath the moss was a vein of quartz so heavily threaded with gold that, in Hollinger's own later words, you could see it shining in the bottom of the hole he had just made by accident. He sat down and laughed for a long time. By the next spring, the Hollinger claim was being developed by a syndicate that included a young Noah Timmins, the merchant whose name would soon be on the new town. The Hollinger mine would, over the next 60 years, produce more than 19 million ounces of gold. It would become for several decades the largest gold producer in the Western Hemisphere. Sandy McIntyre, whose real name was Alexander Oliphant, was a Scottish prospector with a tangled personal history he had walked away from before crossing the Atlantic. He found his vein near a small lake that would later be called Pearl Lake, and the McIntyre Porcupine mine became the second great producer of the camp, eventually going down more than a kilometer and yielding more than 10 million ounces of gold over the following decades. Jack Wilson, working for a Chicago syndicate, made the third great discovery, which would become the Dome Mine, named for the rounded outcrop of gold. Bearing quartz that protruded through the Muskeg, the dome would still be producing more than 100 years after Wilson's first hammer blow, making it one of the longest continuously operating gold mines in the world. And Harry Preston, whose name is least remembered today, found a vein that would become part of the larger Vipond and Pamour properties. Within 12 months of Hollinger's lucky kick at the moss, the Porcupine had become the most talked about piece of bush in North America, and Canadian deep mining was about to enter a new era. The men of cobalt began drifting north, bringing their hard-won skills, and the camp at Porcupine was, in its first years, essentially cobalt transplanted into deeper, harder, richer ground. The new gold mines had problems cobalt had never faced. The Porcupine ore was not in narrow native silver veins close to the surface. It was in broad quartz lodes that pitched downward at steep angles, and following them meant going deep fast. By 1911, the Hollinger was already at 150 meters. By 1915, it was past 300. By the late 1920s, the main shafts were past 900 meters and still descending. And the rock at depth in the Porcupine was harder, hotter, and more prone to burst than anything the cobalt miners had encountered. The early shafts were sunk by hand drilling and slow blasting, 4 men to a heading, candles and carbide lamps, and later electric lamps strung on cables. The head frames that rose over Timmins through the 1910s and 1920s were among the tallest wooden structures in Canada, replaced eventually with steel as the loads grew heavier and the cages and skips got bigger. And the camp was barely getting started when, on a hot, dry summer day, it almost died. On July 11th, 1911, after a bone-dry spring and an even drier early summer, several small bushfires that had been smoldering for weeks in the slash, piles and pine windfalls around the camp were caught by a steady southwest wind. By mid-afternoon, the separate fires had merged into a single front that swept across the Muskeg toward the new mining settlements at Cochrane, South Porcupine, Pottsville, and Golden City. The fire moved faster than a man could run. It moved faster than a galloping horse. Witnesses described pine trees exploding from the heat before the flame front even reached them, blasting fire into the air 100 meters in advance. Burning embers were carried by the wind to start new fires 3 and 4 kilometers ahead of the main blaze. Within hours, the bush settlements were burning, the small wood frame buildings of the early camp going up like tinder. At the West Dome Mine, just outside the present town of South Porcupine, more than 70 men, women, and children took shelter in the main shaft, climbing or being lowered down into the cold, wet dark while the surface above them burned. They survived, although the steel ropes on the head frame glowed red from the heat. At the Hollinger, the crew flooded the timber framing of the head frame with water from the mill ponds and managed to save the main shaft, although nearly every other building on the property burned to ash. At the dome itself, the original wooden buildings were lost completely. Across the camp, more than 70 people died in the Great Porcupine Fire of 1911. Some drowned trying to escape into Porcupine Lake, where the water boiled along the shoreline and steam scalded those who waded out. Others were caught on the trails between camps. The town of South Porcupine was wiped from the map. Cochrane, 50 kilometers away, also burned to its foundations that same evening as the same weather system drove a separate front through the railway settlement there. In a single afternoon and night, the new gold camp of northern Ontario was nearly destroyed. What happened next told you what kind of people had come to the Porcupine. They did not leave. Within weeks, the rebuilding started. The mines were back in production within months. Houses went up faster than they had the first time, this time often with steel roofs and tin siding ordered by rail from the south. Mine managers ordered new head frames, often building them stronger and bigger than the originals. The Hollinger, the McIntyre, the Dome, the Vipond, the Pamour, the Coniorum, the Buffalo Anchorite, all of them either kept working through the fire or were back in production by the following year. The town of Timmins was incorporated in 1912, named for Noah Timmins of the Hollinger Syndicate, and within 10 years it was one of the largest and richest small cities in Canada. The Great Fire had killed people, it had destroyed property, and it had nearly ended the camp. But it had not ended it, and the lesson the Porcupine took from those terrible days was not to retreat. It was to dig deeper. Because the surface ore was already starting to thin. The rich, oxidized gold caps that the first prospectors had hammered out by hand were running out within a few years of being found. To keep the mills running, the new shafts had to chase the veins down into the primary rock. By 1914, the Hollinger was past 300 meters. By 1920, it was at 550. By 1928, when the Great Hollinger Fire broke out underground and killed 39 miners in one of the worst gold mining disasters in Canadian history, the workings were past 900 meters deep and spread across more than 70 kilometers of underground tunnels. We will come back to that fire because it changed everything about how Canadian mines were ventilated and how their refuge stations were built, and the lessons learned from it are the reason that, today, miners in any modern Canadian operation carry a self-contained breathing apparatus on their belt at all times. But before we get there, we need to look east to the other half of the Northern Ontario gold story. Because while the Porcupine was rising from its own ashes, prospectors were poking into a band of greenstone about 90 kilometers further south and east in the region that would become known as Kirkland Lake. And what they would find there would not just match the Porcupine. In dollar per ton terms, it would surpass it. Kirkland Lake was a small body of water that in 1911 sat almost completely surrounded by trackless bush. There was no town. There was a lone trapper's cabin. The closest rail line was 20 kilometers away. In the summer of that year, 4 prospectors, working independently in different parts of the same volcanic belt, made discoveries that would change the geography of northern Ontario forever. Their names were William Wright, Edward Hargreaves, Sandy McIntyre, who had already found one fortune in the Porcupine and would now probably find a second, and Harry Oakes. The last of those names would become one of the most famous and infamous in Canadian history, and we will come back to it. William Wright was a 35-year-old former butcher from Hull, England, who had come to Canada as a young man, fought in the Boer War with the Royal Canadian Dragoons, and then drifted north as a prospector. He was tall, thin, soft-spoken, and famously patient. His partner, Ed Hargreaves, was his brother-in-law. In the summer of 1911, the two of them found a vein on the south shore of Kirkland Lake that they staked together. It would become the Wright Hargreaves mine, eventually producing more than 4 million ounces of gold and operating for almost 50 years. Sandy McIntyre, working a separate set of claims on the north side of the lake, sold his interest shortly afterward, in keeping with his lifelong pattern of finding fortunes and then losing them. The claims he sold would become the Teck Hughes mine and several others. McIntyre himself, true to form, died poor, although he saw both of his great discoveries become enormously productive. Harry Oakes was a different kind of man. He was an American, born in Maine, trained as a mining engineer, and possessed of the most relentless, single-minded, almost obsessive temperament of any prospector in the camp. He had spent more than a decade wandering the gold fields of California, Alaska, Australia, the Belgian Congo, and the Philippines before drifting north into Ontario. He had been beaten up, robbed, frozen, starved, and ridiculed. When he arrived in Kirkland Lake in 1911, he was nearly 40, and he was broke. He camped in a small cabin at the edge of the lake through the winter of 1911 to 1912, working his ground in temperatures that fell to minus 40, breaking his own outcrops by hand. Every other prospector in the camp wrote off his claims as worthless. He kept working, and in the spring of 1912, beneath the moss and gravel of the south shore, in a low spot that nobody else had thought worth examining, he struck the main vein of what would become the Lake Shore Mine. It would become the richest and deepest of all the Kirkland Lake gold mines, producing more than 8.5 million ounces of gold and making Oakes, by the 1930s, one of the wealthiest men in the British Empire. There were others: the Macassa, the Wright Hargreaves, the Teck Hughes, the Sylvanite, the Kirkland Lake Gold Mine, the Toburn, the Tough Oaks, the Bidgood. 7 mines in a row along a 4-kilometer stretch became known as the Mile of Gold, although the actual distance was rather longer. By the late 1920s, Kirkland Lake had eclipsed even the Porcupine in per-ton richness, and its mines were diving toward depths that had only ever been seen in South Africa. The lake shore alone, by 1939, was producing more gold than any other single mine in the Western world outside of South Africa. It went down past 1,500 meters before the Second World War. Macassa, its neighbor, would eventually go past 2,500 meters and become, by the early 21st century, the deepest mine in Canada. The depths were forced by economics. The veins kept paying. As long as the gold was there, the engineers found ways to chase it. Head frames grew taller. Hoists grew more powerful. Steel ropes replaced hemp and manila. Electric haulage replaced mules and ponies. Refrigeration plants were installed at the surface to push cold air down into the workings, because by 1930, the natural rock temperature at the bottom of Lake Shore was already over 30 degrees, and the men working there were stripped to the waist and soaked through with sweat the moment they reached the face. The wealth that came out of Kirkland Lake transformed everything it touched. Harry Oakes built himself a fieldstone mansion on the hill above the lake, became a Canadian citizen, was eventually knighted, and was so heavily taxed by the Canadian government that in a famous fit of pique, he moved to the Bahamas to escape it. There, in July 1943, in a story that has never been fully solved, he was murdered in his own bed in mysterious circumstances involving feathers, fire, and a son-in-law who was charged, tried, and acquitted in a trial that scandalized the British colonial world. Oakes's killer was never definitively identified, and the case remains one of the great open mysteries of the 20th century. But that lay decades after his Kirkland Lake fortune was made, and it should not eclipse what he and his contemporaries actually did. They sank shafts that, by the standards of their day, were among the deepest in the world. They invented techniques. They trained generations of men. They funded the development of half of northern Ontario. And while they were doing all of that, in the third great mineral district of the north, something even bigger was happening. The nickel basin around Sudbury was about to become not just the largest nickel producer in the world, but the geological setting of the deepest mining shafts ever sunk in this hemisphere. To understand what makes Sudbury different, you have to go back not hundreds of years, not thousands, not even millions, but 1,850,000,000 years. Because the Sudbury Basin is not, as it was thought for most of the 20th century, simply a folded mass of unusual sedimentary and igneous rock. It is the remains of one of the largest meteor impacts in the history of the Earth. About 1,850,000,000 years ago, a comet or asteroid, roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across, struck what is now northern Ontario. The impact crater was originally somewhere between 200 and 250 kilometers in diameter, ranking it as one of the 2 or 3 largest known impact structures anywhere on the planet. Over the subsequent 2 billion years, the original crater has been distorted, partially eroded, and squeezed by continental movement into the long oval shape we see today. But the geological signature is unmistakable. The shocked quartz, the impact breccias, the strange melt rocks called the Sudbury Igneous Complex, all of them are the fingerprints of a catastrophic moment when the sky fell on northern Ontario. The meteor did not bring the nickel with it. What it did was punch through the upper crust of the early Earth and allow nickel and copper-bearing sulfide melts, which had been rising slowly through the mantle, to pool around the rim of the resulting crater. As the impact melt sheet cooled, those heavier sulfide droplets settled toward the bottom and outer edge, where they were trapped in a ring of mineralized rock. That ring is what the prospectors of the 1880s and 1890s started chipping at, although none of them knew the actual story. It would not be until the 1960s that geologists, partly inspired by the Apollo program's lunar studies, began to argue seriously that Sudbury was the wreckage of an impact event. Today, that interpretation is overwhelming consensus. The town that grew up around the nickel basin is, quite literally, built on the wound of a cosmic collision. The mines that opened around the rim of the Sudbury Basin in the late 1800s were initially small surface operations and shallow shafts. The Murray Mine, the Coppercliff Mine, the Stobie, and the Creighton were the first to develop into serious deep operations. The Canadian Copper Company, founded in 1886, and its rival the Mond Nickel Company, founded in 1900, eventually merged in 1928 into the International Nickel Company, known forever after by its short name, I&Co. Falconbridge Nickel Mines was incorporated in 1928 as a separate competing operation, and the two companies would dominate the basin for the rest of the 20th century. The nickel they pulled out of the ground would fuel 2 world wars, the entire stainless steel industry, the post-war boom in domestic appliances, the jet engine industry, the nuclear industry, and eventually the rechargeable battery industry. Sudbury nickel was in the armor plate of warships at the Battle of Jutland. It was in the gun barrels at Vimy Ridge. It was in the turbine blades of the first jet fighters. It was in the rocket nozzles that lifted Apollo to the moon, and even on the lunar landers themselves, which made the Apollo crews training in the blasted moon-like landscape outside Sudbury a strange and fitting coincidence. But to keep feeding all of that, the shafts had to keep going down. The Creighton Mine, opened in 1901, would by the late 20th century go past 2,400 meters of depth. The Froude Mine, opened in 1910, would eventually be linked underground to the Stobie to create the enormous Froude-Stobie complex, which produced more ore in the first half of the 20th century than perhaps any single mining property anywhere on Earth. the Copper Cliff North Mine, the Garson, the Macready, the Levack, the Kirkwood, all of them grew, deepened, connected to each other through kilometers of underground haulage drifts, and turned the Sudbury Basin into a single, enormous, three-dimensional industrial complex with thousands of kilometers of tunnel and shaft and decline. There are levels in Sudbury today that have not been visited in 50 years, sealed off, flooded, mapped only by old paper drawings. There are entire deserted workings that simply got too small to bother with as the deeper levels paid better. The engineering required to dig and operate at these depths is not something most people on the surface ever think about. The simplest problem is heat. Inside the Earth, the temperature rises by, on average, about 25 degrees Celsius for every kilometer of depth. 2.5 kilometers down, the natural rock temperature is already approaching 55 to 60 degrees. Without active cooling, the air in those workings would be more than warm enough to kill a working man within hours. Modern deep Canadian mines run enormous surface refrigeration plants that chill millions of liters of water and pump it down into the workings to cool the rock and the air. At Creighton, the chilling plant at the surface is a small power station in its own right. Inside the mine, that chilled water is piped through heat exchangers, sprayed into ventilation airflows, and used to keep the working faces at temperatures a human being can actually tolerate. The next problem is rock stress. At depth, the weight of the overlying rock crushes inward on every opening you cut. Below about a kilometer, the stress is high enough that rock can fail explosively when its support is suddenly removed by blasting. These rock bursts are not just safety hazards. They are, in deep ground, the single most dangerous phenomenon a miner faces. A wall does not slowly crumble, it detonates. Sheets of rock weighing tons can be thrown across a tunnel in a fraction of a second, faster than any human reaction can dodge. Canadian mines have invested for decades in engineering controls to reduce rock burst hazard. Yielding rock bolts, designed to stretch slightly when stress builds up, are everywhere. Cable bolts 20 meters long are anchored deep into the rock around every major opening. Sequential blasting patterns, microseismic monitoring networks that listen continuously for the early creaks and pops of an impending burst, and depressurization drilling where holes are deliberately drilled into highly stressed ground to release the pressure in a controlled way, are all standard. The third problem is water. Even in the seemingly bone-dry Canadian Shield, water finds its way down. Old fault plains carry trickles. Drill holes from previous mining campaigns sometimes intersect water-bearing fractures that nobody knew were there. Mines pump millions of liters a day, every day, to keep the workings open. If the pumps stop for long enough, the workings drown. There are abandoned Canadian shafts that decades after closure are simply lakes turned upside down inside the earth. And the fourth problem is access. To carry men and equipment up and down kilometers of vertical shaft, you need cages and skips moving on steel ropes powered by enormous double drum hoists at the surface. The hoists at Creighton, at La Ronde, at Macassa, at Kidd Creek are among the most powerful machines on continuous duty anywhere in Canada. They run 24 hours a day, in some cases for decades, carrying down crews and supplies and bringing up ore in measured doses. Modern shafts also have ventilation raises, escapeways, service pipes, electrical cables, communications fibers, all running down alongside the production shafts. The infrastructure required to keep a single deep mine open is staggering, both in capital cost and in the level of skill required from the people who operate it. But you don't really feel any of that unless you have been down there. You feel the temperature shift in your ears as the cage descends. You feel the air pressure change. You feel the smell of the rock change from the cool, almost fresh smell of the upper levels to the warm mineral, almost sulphurous smell of the deep ground. You feel the weight of the world above you in a way that is hard to articulate. And in some Canadian mines, you feel something else too, a sense that you are very far from the world of sunlight and that you are walking into a place that is genuinely different from anywhere else on Earth. Before we go further into what is being found at the bottom of these holes today, we need to spend some time with the people who actually dug them, because the depths we are talking about did not come for free. They came at a cost in human life and human labor that the official histories often understate. The men, and eventually the women, who pushed these shafts down through the Canadian Shield were drawn from every corner of the world, and they paid in ways that are sometimes hard to talk about a century later. When cobalt was booming, the workforce came first from the Maritimes and from Cornwall in England, then from Italy and Croatia and Hungary, then from Finland and Sweden, then from the Ukraine, from Poland, from Bohemia, from northern Quebec, from the Ojibwe and Algonquin communities of the surrounding country. When the Porcupine opened, the demographics shifted again, with a heavy Italian and Finnish presence in particular. Timmins by 1920 had a Finnish hall, an Italian hall, a Ukrainian hall, a Croatian hall, a Polish hall, and at least 3 Catholic churches catering to different European traditions. Kirkland Lake by 1930 had similar institutions, plus a strong contingent of Cornish miners and their families who had brought their own deep tradition of hard rock work and their own folk customs, including the famous Cornish miners' belief in the knockers, the small spirits said to inhabit deep workings whose tapping in the rock either warned of danger or led miners to ore. The knockers traveled to northern Ontario in the heads of Cornish men, and old miners in Timmins were still talking about them well into the 1960s. The work was brutal. In the early years, before mechanization, a miner spent his shift on his feet, swinging a heavy hammer against a handheld steel chisel that another man held in place. Pairs of men took turns being the holder and the striker. The job required absolute trust between the two of them, because a missed strike could shatter a hand or a wrist. The drilled holes were then filled with dynamite and blasted, often with the men still in the same heading, sheltered only behind a heavy rock pile. After the blast, the broken rock had to be mucked out by hand with shovels, loaded into ore cars, and pushed by hand to the shaft station, where it was tipped into a chute and hoisted up. Power drills, the famous widowmakers of early hard rock mining, came in around 1900 and were quickly recognized as a mixed blessing. They could drill a hole 5 times faster than 2 men could by hand, but the early models were dry drills, which produced clouds of fine silica dust that the miner inhaled with every breath. Within a few years of work on a dry drill, a man's lungs would begin to scar. Within 10 or 15 years, he would have silicosis, a slow, irreversible, fatal disease that suffocated him from the inside as his lung tissue stiffened. Wet drills, which injected water into the cutting bit to suppress the dust, were introduced gradually and became standard in Ontario by about 1915, but by then thousands of men were already condemned. Silicosis was the great hidden killer of Canadian hard rock mining well into the 1950s, and the death rate from it in the Porcupine and Kirkland Lake camps in the 1920s and 1930s was, by some estimates, comparable to the death rate from major battlefield campaigns. The disease was not properly compensated by Ontario's workers' compensation system until well after most of the men who had earned it were dead. There were also the sudden, visible deaths, falls down shafts, skips that broke loose, cages that overran their guides, hoist ropes that snapped, underground fires, the worst of which was the Hollinger mine fire of February 1928. In that disaster, a fire started in a pile of greasy waste cotton on the 550-foot level. The mine was not equipped with the kind of inert gas suppression systems that became standard later. Smoke spread through the workings faster than anyone could react. 39 men died of carbon monoxide poisoning, many of them in groups in the deep dead, and drifts where they had tried to barricade themselves. The Hollinger fire shocked the country. It led directly to a royal commission, to new ventilation regulations, to the requirement for properly designed refugee stations stocked with food, water, and compressed air, and to the eventual development of the modern self-contained self-rescuer, the small breathing apparatus that every underground miner in Canada now carries on his or her belt by law. Those changes, all of them paid for by the men who died in 1928, have saved untold lives in the decades since. But the men themselves never benefited from them. There were strikes too, some bitter. The 1941 strike at Kirkland Lake, called by Mine Mill, the radical industrial union that organized hard rock miners across the country, was one of the most consequential labor disputes in Canadian history. It lasted 10 weeks through the brutal northern Ontario winter, in temperatures that fell below minus 30 for weeks on end. It was broken by a combination of company hardball tactics, government inaction during a wartime production crisis, and the unyielding cold. The miners lost the immediate fight, but the strike was credited by historians with directly motivating the federal government's passage in 1944 of Privy Council Order 1003, which for the first time guaranteed Canadian workers the right to collective bargaining. The deep miners of Kirkland Lake, in losing, won that right for every working person in the country. There were also disasters whose toll was much smaller in any single incident, but whose cumulative weight on the camps was enormous. A man crushed by a runaway ore car at the Frood. A man asphyxiated in a sealed drift at the Macassa. A man killed by a delayed blast at the McIntyre. A man falling from a hanging stage during shaft sinking at the Creighton. These names appear one by one in the small town newspapers and the company records, and the rate of them, when you add them up, was extraordinary. The Workers' Memorial in Sudbury today carries the names of more than 300 men killed in the mines of that basin alone over the past century. The equivalent memorials in Timmins and Kirkland Lake carry hundreds more. Even now, in 2026, with modern engineering and safety systems and the strictest regulations the industry has ever operated under, the deep Canadian mines continue occasionally to take a life. The job is safer than it has ever been. It is not yet safe. There is one more group of people whose contribution to the underground story has historically been almost completely erased, and we should not let that erasure continue. The land on which every one of these mines was sunk is the unceded or treaty territory of First Nations and Métis communities, whose relationship with that ground long predates the railway and the prospector. Anishinaabe, Cree, Algonquin, and Métis people lived on, hunted on, and traveled across the country that became Cobalt, Porcupine, Kirkland Lake, and Sudbury for thousands of years before Fred LaRose threw his hammer. The mines disrupted hunting grounds, polluted rivers, and reshaped the bush in ways that affected communities whose names were rarely mentioned in the share prospectuses. Some Indigenous men also worked underground. Some prospected for the same companies that were sinking the shafts. The relationship was, and remains, complex. Today, modern Canadian mining operations are required to negotiate impact and benefit agreements with the affected First Nations, and many of the newer mines and exploration projects in the country are partnerships in which Indigenous communities have an explicit stake. The story of the deep Canadian mines is incomplete without their part in it, and that part of the story is still being written. If you have made it this far, you are about to hear the strangest part. So now is a good moment to pause. If you're enjoying this story so far, take 10 seconds and do me a small favor. Drop a like on the video. Leave me a comment with the strangest thing you have ever heard about life underground, because I read them. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is your reminder. Now, let us climb back into the cage and go to the bottom of the deepest holes in this hemisphere and look at what is down there. The deepest active mine in Canada today is the Macassa mine at Kirkland Lake, the same Macassa that started back in 1933 as one of several shafts along the original mile of gold. After nearly a century of continuous extension, in 2026, Macassa reaches more than 2,500 meters below the surface, with active workings clustered around its newest production shaft, completed only in the past few years. 2.5 kilometers straight down. That is a number that is hard to put into a human scale. If you flipped the CN Tower upside down and dropped it into the Macassa shaft, it would not reach the bottom workings. If you stacked 4.5 Eiffel Towers, you still would not reach. The full descent of the cage from surface to bottom takes more than 10 minutes, and the riders, while it does not feel any different than a slow elevator, are traveling further from the sky than they will ever travel in any other vehicle in their lives, except possibly an aircraft. Just east of Macassa, in the Abitibi gold belt of northwestern Quebec, is the La Ronde mine, operated by Agnico Eagle. La Ronde began production in 1988 and was originally a fairly conventional gold operation, but its ore body, like so many in the Canadian Shield, continued to descend with depth, and the mine kept following it. Today, La Ronde's deepest active workings reach beyond 3,000 meters, putting it among the deepest one-cell shafts in the entire Western Hemisphere, and roughly tied with the deepest gold operations in the world outside South Africa. The engineering at La Ronde is, in some respects, more complex than at any other Canadian operation, because the rock stresses at 3 kilometers of depth in the Quebec part of the shield are extreme, and the geometry of the ore body required innovative shaft layouts that had not been used elsewhere. And then there is Kidd Creek. This is the mine where the story bends from history into something stranger. Kidd Creek sits a few kilometers east of Timmins, in the same band of greenstone that produced the Hollinger and the McIntyre and the Dome. But Kidd Creek does not produce gold. It produces copper, zinc, lead, and silver in one of the richest and most unusual volcanogenic, massive sulfide deposits ever found anywhere on Earth. The ore body was first identified in the early 1960s by Texas Gulf Sulfur in a discovery that, when it became public in 1964, triggered one of the most notorious insider trading cases in North American legal history. Executives of the company, knowing about the discovery before it was publicly announced, bought heavily into Texas Gulf stock and made fortunes. The subsequent United States Securities and Exchange Commission case against them, decided in 1968, became the foundation of modern insider trading law. The case is still taught in business schools today, but the ore body itself was the real prize. Kidd Creek is a single massive lens of sulfide ore, roughly 2 kilometers long, deposited on the floor of a deep volcanic sea about 2,700,000,000 years ago. As the lens has been mined out from the top down, the workings have descended steadily. Today, Kidd Creek reaches roughly 3,017 meters below the surface, making it the deepest base metal mine in the world, and one of the deepest active mines of any kind anywhere on Earth. It surpassed the gold mines of South Africa for that particular title some years ago, and has held it since. The bottom of Kidd Creek is closer to the center of the planet than any other operating mine on this continent. And it is in Kidd Creek, beginning in the early 2000s and continuing through to the present day, that the discoveries have been made that we promised at the very beginning of this story. The discoveries that, in the careful judgment of the scientists involved, may change how we understand the history of life on Earth and the possibility of life on other planets. The person at the center of those discoveries is a Canadian geochemist named Barbara Sherwood Lawler, a professor at the University of Toronto. Sherwood Lawler has spent more than 30 years studying the chemistry of deep groundwater, the slow, ancient water that seeps through cracks in the Earth's crust at depths of kilometers below the surface. She first began visiting Kidd Creek in the 1990s, drawn there because of the access the active mine provided to rocks of an age and depth that are almost impossible to study any other way. You cannot drill a research borehole to 3 kilometers of depth in the Canadian Shield. You cannot pay for it. But if a mine is already there, you can ride down in the cage and stand at the face and watch the geology directly. Sherwood Lawler and her team began collecting samples of the salty water that seep from cracks in the deep workings, dating it, analyzing its isotopic chemistry, and trying to figure out where it had come from and how old it was. What they found, over the course of years of patient work, defied expectation. Some of the water they were sampling at depths of more than 2 kilometers at Kidd Creek turned out to be staggeringly old. In a series of papers published in the world's leading scientific journals beginning in 2013 and continuing to the present day, Sherwood Lawler and her colleagues reported that water, trapped in fractures in the deep Canadian Shield at Kidd Creek, was at least 1,500,000,000 years old, and in some samples possibly more than 2,600,000,000 years old. This was, by an enormous margin, the oldest known free-flowing water anywhere on the planet. The previous oldest known water from a deep gold mine in South Africa had been dated at a few tens of millions of years. The Kidd Creek water was older by a factor of 40. To put this in perspective, the Kidd Creek water has been trapped in those rock fractures since long before complex multicellular life evolved on Earth. It has been there since before the Cambrian explosion, since before the first fish, since before the first land plants, since before forests, since before dinosaurs, since before mammals, since before the great oxygenation of the atmosphere that gave the planet its breathable air. It is, quite literally, water from an earlier Earth, water that has been sealed off, frozen in geological time while the surface of the world transformed itself again and again above. And it is right there, 2.5 kilometers beneath, an active Canadian copper mine in northern Ontario. The chemistry of the water is as strange as its age. It is salty, far saltier than seawater. It is rich in dissolved gases, particularly hydrogen, helium, and methane. The hydrogen is being produced continuously, in trace amounts, by a slow chemical reaction between the water and certain minerals in the surrounding rock, a process called radiolysis, in which radiation from naturally occurring uranium and thorium in the rock splits water molecules and frees their hydrogen. The helium in the water is the slowly accumulated byproduct of radioactive decay over billions of years. The total chemistry tells the story of an extraordinarily isolated system that has been quietly processing itself, alone in the dark for an unimaginable span of time. And that is when the second extraordinary discovery emerged. The water at Kidd Creek is not dead. In samples collected from those deep fractures, microbiologists have repeatedly found living microorganisms, bacteria, single-celled organisms with active metabolisms, organisms that are not just dormant spores, but functionally alive, breathing, eating, reproducing slowly in the dark, salty water. They survive without sunlight because there has been no sunlight in their world for as long as their lineage has existed. They survive without oxygen because there has been no oxygen down there either. They survive without any of the food sources that surface life takes for granted. Instead, they feed on the chemistry of the rock itself. They use the dissolved hydrogen produced by radiolysis as their energy source. They strip electrons from it. They combine it with the dissolved sulfate in the water to make hydrogen sulfide, the gas that smells of rotten eggs. They use the resulting energy to build their own bodies out of carbon dioxide and minerals dissolved in the water. They are entire self-contained ecosystems running on radioactive decay and rock chemistry, with no input from the surface world at all. These microbes have a formal name. They are called chemolithotrophs, which means rock-eating organisms. The category was known to biologists before Kidd Creek in shallower settings. But Kidd Creek demonstrated for the first time that chemolithotrophic life could persist in deep crystalline rock fractures for billions of years, in a setting where the energy supply is steady but vanishingly small. The microbes at Kidd Creek divide perhaps once a century, perhaps once a millennium. Their pace of life is slower than anything biology had previously documented. They are alive, but they are alive on a geological clock rather than a biological one. The implications of this are enormous, and they reach far beyond a Canadian copper mine. For the past half-century, the search for life on other planets has been guided by a single basic question. Could life survive in environments that are nothing like the warm, wet, sunlit surface of Earth? Until Kidd Creek, the answer was theoretically yes, but with no clear example of organisms that had actually done it for billions of years in a place cut off from surface conditions. After Kidd Creek, the answer was a clear, demonstrated yes. There are now living organisms documented to have survived for an enormous span of geological time in a setting where the only available energy is the slow radioactive decay of rock and water. If life can do that in northern Ontario, then life could, in principle, do it under the surface of Mars. Mars today has no liquid water on its surface and no breathable atmosphere. But Mars almost certainly has briny water trapped in fractures deep in its crust, and those fractures almost certainly include rocks producing hydrogen by exactly the same kind of radiolysis that operates at Kidd Creek. If life ever existed on Mars, even briefly, in its earlier, wetter geological history, it could in principle still exist today, deep underground, in fractures that have never been disturbed since they first formed. The search for life on Mars has, in part, shifted to deep subsurface exploration because of what was found in a Canadian copper mine. NASA, the European Space Agency, and the agencies of other countries with planetary science programs have all directly funded research at Kidd Creek and at similar deep Canadian mine sites because the science there is the closest analog on Earth to the subsurface of Mars. Sherwood Lawler herself was named a Companion of the Order of Canada in 2019. She has been awarded the Gerhard Hertzberg Canada Gold Medal, the country's top science prize. She has been shortlisted for the Nobel Prize, and she will tell you, if you ask her directly, that her research is not finished. There are still questions about the boundaries of the deep biosphere, about how it connects to the surface, about how much of it survives in other deep Canadian mines beyond Kidd Creek. The deep mines of the Sudbury Basin are being sampled now. The deep mines of Quebec are being sampled. The decommissioned mines of South Africa are being sampled. And in every case, the early results suggest that the underground biosphere is enormous, ancient, slow, and largely unmapped. Some estimates today suggest that the total biomass of life below the surface of the Earth may rival the total biomass of life above it. We have spent 5 centuries learning about the world of sunlight. We are now beginning, only just beginning, to learn about the world of darkness underneath us. And while Sherwood Lawler's team was sampling the deep water at Kidd Creek, 250 kilometers to the southwest, in another active Canadian mine, an even stranger scientific project had been quietly running for decades. We need to talk about it now, because it is the second great reason that the deep Canadian mines are not just an industrial story, but a story of human knowledge. Underneath the city of Sudbury, on the 8,000-foot level of the Creighton mine, in a stretch of unused tunnel 2,070 meters below the surface, is one of the most important scientific laboratories on the planet. it is called SNOLAB. The two letters S and N at the beginning stand for Sudbury neutrino. The rest spells laboratory. SNOLAB is the deepest and cleanest underground laboratory in the world, operated by a consortium of Canadian universities and funded by the federal government, the province of Ontario, and Vail, the mining company that owns Creighton. The story of how SNOLAB got there is worth telling carefully, because it begins with a problem in physics that had been bothering scientists for more than 3 decades. In the 1960s, an American physicist named Raymond Davis Jr. had built an experiment in a deep gold mine in South Dakota to try to count the neutrinos coming from the sun. Neutrinos are nearly massless, electrically neutral particles produced in unimaginable numbers by the nuclear fusion reactions at the core of the sun. They are, by far, the most abundant matter particles in the universe. Roughly 60 billion of them pass through every square centimeter of your body every second, including right now, as you watch this. They do this without disturbing you in the slightest, because neutrinos almost never interact with normal matter. To catch a single one, you need an enormous detector and a great deal of patience. Davis used a tank containing more than 400,000 liters of dry cleaning fluid as his detector, because the chlorine in the dry cleaning fluid would, very occasionally, capture a neutrino and turn into argon, which he could then count by chemical means. Davis succeeded in catching neutrinos from the sun. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2002 for the achievement. But his measurements showed a strange problem. He was catching only about a third of the neutrinos that the standard model of solar physics predicted. The other 2/3 were missing. The solar neutrino problem, as it became known, was one of the great unsolved mysteries of late 20th century physics. Either there was something wrong with our understanding of the sun, which would have been earth-shaking, or there was something wrong with our understanding of neutrinos, which would have been almost as earth-shaking. For decades, nobody knew which was right. The resolution of the problem required a new generation of detectors, and one of the most innovative of those detectors was designed and built by a Canadian lead collaboration deep inside the Creighton mine in Sudbury. The lead scientist on the Canadian project was Arthur MacDonald, a physicist born in Sydney, Nova Scotia, working at Queen's University in Kingston. MacDonald and his colleagues proposed to use 1,000 tons of heavy water on loan from Atomic Energy of Canada Limited as a neutrino detector. Heavy water contains deuterium, the isotope of hydrogen with an extra neutron in its nucleus, and deuterium can interact with neutrinos in 3 different ways, depending on the type of neutrino involved. By measuring the different types of interactions, the experiment could not only count neutrinos, but distinguish between the different flavors of them. Building this detector underground was not optional. Cosmic rays, the high-energy particles that constantly rain down on the surface of the Earth, would have overwhelmed any neutrino signal in a surface laboratory. The detector had to be deep enough underground that the rock above shielded it from cosmic ray interference. Creighton, with its more than 2 kilometers of overlying rock, was deep enough. In fact, the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, as the original detector was called, was when it was first commissioned in 1999, the second deepest research laboratory anywhere on Earth, surpassed only by an experiment at the Mponeng gold mine in South Africa. The detector itself was an engineering marvel. A spherical acrylic vessel, 12 meters in diameter, holding the 1,000 tons of heavy water, was suspended inside an outer cavity by a precise system of ropes. Around the heavy water, an array of 9,522 photomultiplier tubes watched constantly for the tiny flashes of light produced when a neutrino interacted with the deuterium. The entire assembly was bathed in ordinary purified water for additional shielding and stability, and the whole thing was sealed inside a cavity blasted out of the bedrock more than 2 kilometers beneath the surface. Bringing the components down through the mine on the same cages that hauled ore from Creighton was a logistical feat that took years. Every screw, every bolt, every meter of cable had to ride the cage down. Some of the photomultiplier tubes had to be assembled underground because they were too large to fit through the head frame. In 2001, only 2 years after operations began, the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory team announced the resolution of the solar neutrino problem. The neutrinos were not missing. They were changing. The mathematics confirmed conclusively that neutrinos were oscillating between 3 different flavors as they traveled from the sun to the earth, and Davis had only been catching one of those flavors. The sun was producing exactly the number of neutrinos that solar physics predicted. The mystery had been a mystery about neutrinos themselves, not about the sun, and the implications were profound. Because neutrinos can oscillate between flavors, they must have mass, which the original standard model of particle physics had said they did not. The discovery was one of the most important results in physics in decades, and in 2015, Arthur McDonald was jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics with the Japanese physicist Takaaki Kajita for the work. The Nobel medal sits today in a quiet display in Kingston, not far from where the heavy water now sits, decommissioned and returned to Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, but the cavity in which it was used is still there, still being used by the new generation of experiments at the same underground site. After the Nobel Prize work was complete, the underground facility at Creighton did not close down. It expanded. The original Sudbury Neutrino Observatory cavity was joined by additional excavations, and the entire complex was renamed Snow Lab to reflect its new mission as a permanent underground laboratory hosting multiple experiments. Today, Snow Lab occupies more than 5,000 square meters of underground space, all of it operated as a Class 2000 clean room, which means it is held to standards of cleanliness more typical of a semiconductor fabrication plant than of a working mine. Workers entering the lab change out of their mining gear into clean coveralls, pass through air showers, and follow protocols designed to keep dust, radon, and other contaminants at the lowest possible levels. The reason for this obsessive cleanliness is that the experiments running at Snow Lab are looking for signals so faint that even a trace of background radioactivity from a careless human bringing dust from the surface could drown them out. The experiments currently running at Snow Lab include some of the most ambitious physics projects in the world. Several of them are searches for dark matter, the mysterious substance that astronomers know must exist because of its gravitational effects on galaxies, but which has never been directly detected. Dark matter is thought to make up about 85% of all the matter in the universe. We can see its gravitational pull. We can map its distribution across the heavens. But we have never caught a particle of it in a laboratory. Snow Lab is one of the leading places in the world where that catch may eventually be made. The DE-AP 3600 experiment at Snow Lab uses 3,600 kilograms of liquid argon cooled to extreme cold as a target for hypothetical dark matter particles. If a dark matter particle were to strike an argon atom, the impact would produce a tiny flash of ultraviolet light, which an array of photomultiplier tubes around the argon would detect. The PKO experiment uses superheated fluid, held in a state where the slightest disturbance will cause it to boil locally, as another kind of dark matter trap. If a dark matter particle interacts with a nucleus in the fluid, the resulting energy deposition produces a microscopic bubble, which the apparatus then photographs and records. The NEWS-G experiment uses a sphere of pressurized gas to look for very light dark matter particles. The Super CDMS Snow Lab experiment uses arrays of cryogenic silicon and germanium crystals. Each of these projects is led or co-led by Canadian universities in collaboration with international partners. Each is hunting, in its own way, for the most elusive prey in physics. There are other experiments at Snow Lab beyond dark matter, too. The Snow Pus experiment, occupying the original heavy water cavity, is now filled with a special liquid scintillator and is hunting for an even rarer process called neutrinolysis double beta decay, which, if observed, would prove that neutrinos are their own antiparticles. The helium and lead observatory experiment looks at neutrinos from supernovae. The biology programs at Snow Lab sample the deep biosphere of the surrounding rock, joining the research that Barbara Sherwood-Lawler's group has been doing at Kidd Creek, and adding the Sudbury Basin data to the global picture of deep underground life. There is something almost poetic about all of this. The Creighton mine was sunk to dig nickel out of the bottom of a meteor crater. The nickel paid for warships and jet engines and stainless steel kitchen appliances. The mine got deeper and deeper, chasing the ore. And then, at the very bottom, in spaces that mining had created but no longer needed, the country put in a laboratory that has answered one of the deepest questions in physics and is now reaching towards several more. The same shafts that lower miners to the working face also lower physicists to their detectors. The same hoist ropes that lift ore to the surface lift, on other days, samples of cosmic ray-free silicon or the bones of dark matter, searches that need to be returned for repair, or the personal effects of a graduate student finishing a long night shift on an experiment. The two purposes share the same infrastructure and they cooperate. Vail, the mining company that owns Creighton, considers Snow Lab part of its operating responsibility and works closely with the laboratory's operations team to keep both functions running side by side. There is, frankly, no other partnership quite like it anywhere in the world. Beyond Creighton and Kidd Creek, other Canadian deep mines have begun to be recognized as scientific resources as well. The Garson mine in Sudbury hosts smaller-scale physics experiments. The Quirk mine in Elliott Lake, an abandoned uranium mine now flooded and closed, was for years the home of an underground laboratory operated by Laurentian University. Discussions are ongoing about establishing additional laboratory space in the deeper levels of other Canadian operations. The country is, slowly, beginning to recognize that the holes its prospectors and miners have spent more than a century digging are not just industrial assets, but national scientific infrastructure, and the implications are still unfolding, because what was found at Kidd Creek and what continues to be found at Snow Lab has changed how the rest of the world thinks about the deep underground. NASA's Mars Sample Return Program is being designed in part with the lessons of Sherwood-Lawler's work in mind. Future Mars landers may include drill assemblies designed to access subsurface fractures because of what we learned in northern Ontario about where deep life can hide. The discoveries in the dark, salty waters of the deep Canadian Shield have helped reshape what humanity is looking for, and where humanity is looking for it, in the larger search for life beyond Earth. Now let us step back, because we have traveled a long way down. We started with French soldiers chipping at coal in 1720. We went under the Atlantic Ocean with the colliers of Cape Breton. We followed Tom Froude and Rinaldo McConnell into the railway cut at Sudbury in 1883. We watched Fred LaRose throw his hammer at a fox at Cobalt in 1903. We climbed up through the Porcupine Fire of 1911 with the men sheltering in the dome shaft. We pushed deeper with Harry Oakes at the lakeshore, with the engineers of the Hollinger and the McIntyre, with the Falconbridge and Inco mines of the Sudbury Basin. We pushed past 1 kilometer. We pushed past 2. We pushed past 3. We met the men and eventually the women whose hands and lungs and lives built the shafts. We saw the disasters that brought the modern safety regime into existence. We saw the strikes that won collective bargaining for every Canadian worker. And then, At the very bottom, in the deepest spaces ever cut by human beings on this continent, we found something that nobody, not the first prospectors, not the engineers, not the company directors, not the union organizers, ever imagined would be there. We found water older than complex life. We found microbes that have been alive for longer than complex life has existed on this planet. We found neutrinos from the sun behaving in ways that rewrote the standard model of physics. We found the cleanest laboratories on Earth. We found the best place on this planet to hunt for dark matter. We found, in short, that the holes Canada had spent a century digging into its own bedrock were not just mines. They were doorways. They led into a part of the natural world that no other country had so direct an access to, and that the rest of the world was eventually going to come to study, because the discoveries were too important to ignore. That brings us to the present moment, and to a question that is not a question of history, but a question of policy and culture and national imagination. What should Canada do with these holes, now that the picture is fully clear? Some of them, like the Hollinger and the Wright Hargreaves and most of the old Cobalt Camp, are long closed and partially flooded, mute under the snow of northern Ontario. Some, like Creighton and Macassa and LaRonde and Kidd Creek, are still actively producing ore and will continue to do so for years, possibly decades. But every mine has an end. Even the richest deposits run out eventually. The ore body at Kidd Creek, vast and rich as it has been, will not last forever. The reserves at Creighton are deep but finite. At some point in the next 20 to 50 years, every one of these holes will reach the end of its useful life as a producer. What happens then? The legal and engineering answer is that when a mine closes in Canada, it must be sealed and remediated according to a closure plan that has been negotiated in advance with the provincial regulator. Pumps are turned off. The shafts gradually flood. Surface buildings are demolished. Tailings ponds are stabilized. Eventually, after a sufficient interval, the company that owned the mine is released from its long-term liability for the site, and what remains is a small piece of disturbed ground in the bush surrounded by warning signs, with a flooded shaft somewhere underneath that no one will ever visit again. This is the default outcome, and it is what happens to most mines. But it is not the only possible outcome, and the experience of SNOLAB has begun to make some people in the Canadian science community ask whether it should be. Because once a deep mine is flooded, the cost of reopening it as a scientific facility becomes nearly prohibitive. Pumping it out, restoring its ventilation, certifying it as safe for human occupancy, replacing its hoist and its electrical infrastructure would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The only reason SNOLAB exists at Creighton is that Vail, the operator, agreed to host the lab while the mine was still producing, and to commit to maintaining the infrastructure that the lab needs even as mining activity gradually scales back. That kind of arrangement is rare. It has not been replicated elsewhere on the same scale, although smaller versions exist in some other countries. If Canada chooses to do nothing, the deep mines of this country will gradually close one by one. The pumps will stop, the workings will flood, and the doorways into the deep biosphere and the deep physics laboratory will swing quietly shut behind us. The samples that have not yet been collected will not be collected. The experiments that have not yet been designed will not run. The data that has not yet been gathered will be lost, not catastrophically, but gradually, as opportunities expire. If Canada chooses to act, however, the situation is different. There is a serious argument, advanced by a growing number of scientists and policymakers, that the country should designate several of its deep mines as long-term national research infrastructure, fund their continued operation past the end of their economic mining lives, and invite the world to come and use them. The cost would be substantial. But the deep underground research opportunities in this country are unmatched anywhere in the world, except perhaps in South Africa, where similar mines exist, but where the political and economic environment is more uncertain. Canada, by virtue of being a stable, wealthy, scientifically literate country with the deepest mines in the Western Hemisphere, has an asset that nobody else on this continent can match. The question is whether we choose to recognize that asset and invest in it, or whether we let it slip away. This is the debate that is being had right now, in quiet rooms in Ottawa and Sudbury and Kingston and Toronto. It is not a debate that has reached the general public. Most Canadians have never heard of SnowLab. Most Canadians have never heard of Barbara Sherwood Lawler's work. Most Canadians have never thought about the deep biosphere under their feet, or about the dark matter experiments running underneath the bedrock of northern Ontario. It is one of the strangest features of our country that we host, on our own territory, scientific work of the absolute first rank, and most of us do not know it. There are other parts of the deep Canadian mine story we have not yet told, and we should not leave them out before we close. Because the gold camps and the nickel basin are not the whole picture, even within the country. In the northern reaches of Saskatchewan, in the Athabasca Basin, lie the richest uranium deposits ever discovered anywhere on Earth. Cigar Lake, MacArthur River, Key Lake, and Rabbit Lake have produced uranium ores so concentrated that the original samples had to be handled with special procedures to protect workers from radiation. The MacArthur River mine, opened in 2000, has produced ore that in places was more than 20% uranium by weight, which is more than 100 times the concentration of typical uranium deposits elsewhere in the world. The Saskatchewan uranium mines do not go as deep as the Ontario nickel and gold mines, but they have their own engineering challenges, including groundwater that flows in such enormous volumes that some of the operations have used ground freezing as a regular part of their development plan, sinking refrigeration boreholes around the working area to create a temporary wall of frozen rock and water that allows mining to proceed. In the Northwest Territories, the Ekati and Diavik diamond mines, opened in 1998 and 2003 respectively, are among the most northerly mines of their kind in the world. They sit on the Lac de Gras kimberlite field, where ancient volcanic pipes brought diamonds up from depths of more than 100 kilometers in the mantle. Both Ekati and Diavik began as open pit mines, but as the surface ore was exhausted, they transitioned to underground operations as well. Today, they continue to produce some of the most valuable diamonds in the world from one of the most remote operating environments on the planet, accessible only by air for most of the year and by a winter road that crosses frozen lakes during the brief season when the ice is thick enough to support truck traffic. The Canadian diamond industry, almost entirely unknown to the world before 1998, is now among the top 3 by value globally, and the mines of the Northwest Territories have themselves descended into the kind of deep working environments that the Ontario gold and nickel mines pioneered. In Labrador and on Baffin Island and in northern Quebec, iron ore mines have operated for decades, supplying steel mills in Canada and around the world. The Iron Ore Company of Canada at Labrador City, the Bloom Lake operations, the Mary River mine on Baffin Island, all of them represent a different kind of Canadian deep extraction, one focused on bulk commodities rather than precious metals. The Mary River mine in particular has become a fascinating Arctic engineering story, with ore shipped out by special ice-strengthened bulk carriers during a summer shipping window that is just a few months long each year. And in Newfoundland and Labrador at Voisey's Bay, one of the most remarkable nickel discoveries of the 20th century was made in the early 1990s by a pair of prospectors, Chris Verbisky and Albert Chislett, who were looking for diamonds and found nickel by accident. The Voisey's Bay deposit, eventually acquired by Inco in a celebrated bidding war, contains some of the highest grade nickel ore in the world, and the mine that has been developed there is now producing ore that is shipped to Sudbury for processing. The discovery of Voisey's Bay is a reminder that Canada's mineral wealth is far from exhausted, and that even today, in a country mapped and surveyed and prospected for more than a century, major discoveries continue to be made. The British Columbia mines have their own histories too. The Britannia mine on Howe Sound was, for a brief period in the 1920s, the largest copper producer in the British Empire. It is now a museum, the Britannia Mine Museum, which gives some sense of what an early 20th century deep mine looked like, although it never reached the depths of its Ontario cousins. The Sullivan mine at Kimberley produced lead, zinc, and silver for more than a century before closing in 2001. The Highland Valley copper operation in the southern interior is one of the largest copper mines in the country today, although it is mostly an open pit. And in the Yukon, the legacy of the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898 lives on in the placer operations of Bonanza Creek and El Dorado Creek, where individual prospectors and small companies still wash gravel for gold every summer, and where the largest modern operations are in the Coffee Creek and White Gold districts, where new generations of geologists are finding hard rock gold sources that the placer miners of the 1890s had no way to access. The point of this brief tour is not to catalog every Canadian mining district. The point is to make clear that what we have been telling you about the deep mines of Ontario and Quebec is not the whole story of Canadian mining. It is, however, the part of the story where the depths have gone furthest, the science has gone deepest, and the discoveries at the bottom have been the most consequential. The Ontario and Quebec deep mines are a particular kind of national resource, one that combines geology, history, engineering, science, and culture in a way that very few other places in this country, or in any other, can match. There are stories from the deep that we have not yet told you, and we should tell some of them now, because the lived experience of working a mile or two beneath the surface is a part of this history that is rarely heard outside the industry. Miners who have spent their working lives at the deepest levels of Macassa or Creighton or Kidd Creek will tell you, if you sit with them for a while, that the deep ground is different. The air has a particular smell that you cannot mistake. The rock has a particular sound when you tap it, denser and slower than the rock near the surface. The lighting is artificial, of course, and the men work under headlamps and bright industrial fixtures, but there is a quality to the darkness around those fixtures that you do not encounter anywhere else. The dark at depth is not the dark of a moonless night on the surface. It is heavier, it is older, it rests against your skin in a way that is impossible to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. There are auditory phenomena that miners learn to recognize. The slow popping and groaning of rock under stress, low-frequency sounds that travel through the surrounding stone for kilometers and arrive at the working face as faint, unattributed creaks. The high-frequency clicks of localized microseismic activity, which the modern monitoring networks pick up automatically, but which experienced miners can sometimes hear directly with their own ears. The soft, almost musical resonance of large, open chambers, where the slightest sound bounces in unexpected ways. The unsettling silence in the deepest dead-end drifts, where no air is circulating, and the rock around you is essentially as old as the planet itself. There are visual phenomena, too. In some Canadian mines, the deep ore bodies contain minerals that fluoresce under ultraviolet light, and miners with appropriate lamps have seen entire walls light up in unexpected colors when they shone their lights across particular sections of rock. The native silver flake at cobalt sometimes had this property, and cobalt miners in the 1920s and 1930s told stories of underground caves of glowing silver that, on more careful inspection, turned out to be ordinary working faces with unusual mineral assemblages catching the light just right. There are also the stories that science cannot quite explain, although the men telling them will admit, if pressed, that they are not really claiming anything supernatural. The Cornish miners' knockers we have already mentioned. The tradition, common in many deep mines across Canada, of certain corridors and certain workings being considered unlucky, with the bad luck attributed sometimes to past accidents, and sometimes to a feeling that the rock itself was unsettled in that particular place. The careful refusal of many old-timers to whistle underground, a tradition probably brought from Cornwall and Wales and northern Italy, and now half forgotten, but still observed by a surprising number of working miners even today. The little statues of saints, the photographs of family members, the small offerings of bread or candy that miners of various backgrounds have left at particular points in particular workings, where the practice has passed quietly from one generation to the next. None of this is in the official company history. All of it is part of the actual culture of the deep Canadian mines. There are the practical, unsung accomplishments. The complete map of the Sudbury Basin underground, assembled over more than a century by surveyors working with theodolites and tape measures and now lasers, is one of the most detailed three-dimensional structural maps of any portion of the Earth's crust anywhere in the world. The Hollinger workings beneath Timmins, although the mine itself closed decades ago, were so extensively mapped that the city has had to take seriously the long-term subsidence implications of the cavities below it. Some of the streets of Timmins are built directly above old gold workings, whose stability is now monitored by instruments that were not invented when the mines themselves were sunk. There is the long, slow, careful work of mine closure remediation, which is itself a Canadian export industry. Engineers and consultants who learned their trade closing Ontario mines now work all over the world, helping other countries deal with their own legacies of underground extraction. The protocols for sealing and flooding a shaft, for treating long-term acid mine drainage, for monitoring abandoned tailings impoundments, for restoring surface vegetation on disturbed ground, all of these are skills that Canada has developed by hard experience and now teaches to the rest of the world. There is the role of Canadian mining schools in shaping the global profession. Queen's University in Kingston, the University of Toronto, McGill University in Montreal, Laurentian University in Sudbury, the University of British Columbia, and Cambrian College and Northern College in Northern Ontario. Between them, train a sizable proportion of the world's senior mining engineers, geologists, metallurgists, and mine surveyors. The deep mining curriculum at these institutions draws directly on the experience of the working operations described in this video. A graduate student writing a thesis on rock mechanics at 3 kilometers of depth probably did her fieldwork at LaRonde or Kidd Creek. A young mine engineer learning about ventilation in extreme environments probably had his class field trip at Creighton. The Canadian academic tradition in mining engineering is interlocked with the Canadian operating tradition in deep mining, and they reinforce each other. There is the role of Canadian mining technology companies in supplying the world. From the manufacture of cable bolts to the design of refrigeration plants, to the development of microseismic monitoring systems, to the production of underground utility vehicles, Canadian firms have grown up around the deep mines of Ontario and Quebec and now sell their products and services on every continent. Some of these companies are large, publicly traded firms. Many are small, family-owned operations, employing a dozen or 2 dozen people in a small northern Ontario town that quietly supply specialized equipment to mines on 5 continents. They are part of an ecosystem that, again, most Canadians have never thought about. And there is the long-term economic importance of the deep mining sector itself, which has been one of the most consistent contributors to Canadian gross domestic product for more than a century. Mining and the industries directly downstream from it, including metals processing, equipment manufacturing, and engineering services, employ several 100,000 Canadians and contribute tens of billions of dollars annually to the national economy. The taxes paid by these industries and their employees fund hospitals, schools, transit systems, and pensions across the country. The royalties paid by the operating companies to the federal and provincial governments fund the universities at which the next generation of deep mining engineers are trained. The whole system has been, for a long time, more important to Canada than is usually credited in our public conversation about who we are and what our economy actually rests on. And underneath all of that, beneath the economic and technological and scientific layers, are the holes themselves, the actual physical openings in the rock. They were dug by individual men and women, swinging hammers and operating drills and driving trucks and running hoists. They contain, in their walls and in their water and in their dust, the trace evidence of every shift that was ever worked in them. They contain the names of every person who died in them, recorded in the official records and remembered in the unofficial ones. They contain the gold and the silver and the nickel and the copper and the zinc that built modern Canada. They contain the cleanest laboratories on earth, doing some of the most precise science ever attempted. They contain water older than complex life, and microbes that have survived for longer than the dinosaurs walked the planet. They contain a story that is, taken together, almost impossibly rich. And the discoveries are not finished. Even now, in the year 2026, new science is coming out of these mines on a regular basis. Last year, a team of researchers at Laurentian University published results from a new sampling program in the deep workings of an abandoned section of the Stobie mine in Sudbury, finding microbial communities that appear to be even more isolated than those previously documented at Kidd Creek. Earlier this year, a Canadian-led collaboration with researchers from France and the United Kingdom announced the detection of trace amounts of helium isotopes in the deep Kidd Creek waters that may push the age estimates for some of the trapped water back even further than the previous record. There is preliminary work being done at La Ronde on the chemistry of the deep rock fractures there, and early indications suggest that the deep biosphere at La Ronde may have its own distinct microbial communities, slightly different from those at Kidd Creek, with their own evolutionary history. There is ongoing work at SNOLAB on a new generation of dark matter detectors that will be more sensitive by several orders of magnitude than the current generation. If these new experiments succeed in detecting dark matter directly, the announcement will be one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the century, and it will be made from a clean room 2 kilometers beneath the city of Sudbury in a cavity originally blasted out of the rock by miners following a nickel vein. There is the slow, ongoing characterization of the deep groundwater systems beneath the Canadian Shield, which may eventually be used to track and trace the movement of water through the crust over geological time. There is research into using deep abandoned mines as long-term storage facilities for low-level radioactive waste, with the geological stability of the Canadian Shield offering, in principle, one of the safest disposal environments on Earth. There is research into the possibility of using deep mine cavities as compressed air energy storage facilities, helping to balance the loads on the electrical grid in regions with intermittent wind and solar generation. There is interest from companies in the geothermal energy sector in using the high temperatures encountered at the deepest levels of Canadian mines as sources of heat for direct geothermal generation. There is interest from the Canadian Space Agency and from foreign space agencies in using deep mine analog sites for training astronauts and testing equipment intended for use on Mars and on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. There is interest from cryptocurrency operators who have noticed that the cool, stable temperatures of deep mine air make excellent free cooling for computer server farms. The deep holes of Canada are turning out to have more uses than anyone imagined. And of course, there is interest from mining companies themselves in going still deeper. Several of the active operations in Sudbury and in Timmins and in the Abitibi belt of Quebec have ongoing studies of how much further their existing ore bodies extend below current working depths. In some cases, the answer is several hundred meters. In a few cases, the answer is more than a kilometer. The deepest active mine in Canada today, at 2.5 kilometers, may not hold that title for very long. Within a decade or two, one of the Ontario or Quebec operations may pass 3 kilometers of working depth, joining the elite handful of South African gold mines that have, until now, been the only operations on the planet to reach that range. There is a quiet engineering race going on around the world for the title of deepest active mine. Canada is in that race. So is South Africa. So, in the future, maybe Australia and Russia and the United States. The technologies required to mine at depths beyond 3 kilometers are pushing the limits of what current rock mechanics, ventilation engineering, and human physiology will tolerate. Some serious analysts argue that beyond about 4 kilometers, the conventional model of underground mining with human workers in the working phase simply will not be viable, and that future deep mines will have to be operated by remote control or by autonomous machines. Canadian companies are at the leading edge of that automation work too, and the deep mines of Sudbury and Timmins have become test beds for autonomous underground haulage trucks, remotely operated drill rigs, and centrally monitored production systems that move ore from the working face to the surface with no human being underground at the production zone at all. The question of where all of this leads and how much further we can go is not really an engineering question alone. It is also a question of values, of national interest, and of what kind of relationship Canada wants to have with the deep earth beneath its feet for the next century and beyond. The deep mines have given this country an enormous amount over the past 150 years. Wealth, employment, technology, science, identity. They have also taken from this country lives, lung function, ecosystems, water quality, traditional territories. The balance sheet is complicated, and any honest accounting has to include all of it. What is clear, however, is that the deep mines are not just industrial sites. They are not just places where rock is broken and metal is sold. They are places where some of the most fundamental questions about the natural world are being answered, where some of the most consequential discoveries of the past quarter century have been made, and where the work that is still ongoing will, almost certainly, produce more discoveries in the years to come. They are doorways into a part of the planet that most of humanity has never seen, and that, until very recently, most scientists believed could not contain anything interesting at all. They have proven everyone wrong, repeatedly, and they will, in all probability, do it again. The Canadian Shield is one of the oldest stable continental masses on the surface of the planet. The rocks at the surface in places like Timmins and Sudbury and Kirkland Lake are between 2.5 and 3 billion years old. The mines we have dug into those rocks have given us, slowly and through enormous effort, a small set of openings into what is essentially the deep interior of one of the oldest landscapes on Earth. Through those openings, we have learned things that we could not have learned any other way. We have caught water and microbes and neutrinos that nothing else on this continent could have caught. We have done physics and biology and geology that took us beyond what any textbook said was possible, and we have done it, by and large, without telling our own story very well. Most Canadians, asked to name 3 Canadian mines, would struggle. Asked to name 1 Canadian Nobel laureate in physics, most would not be able to. Asked about Barbara Sherwood Lawler's work on the oldest water on Earth, most would never have heard of it. There is a strange, persistent humility, or perhaps a strange, persistent indifference in the way that this country talks about its own underground accomplishments. The deep mines have made this country what it is, and have made some of the most important scientific contributions in our national history. And the average Canadian has no idea. Maybe this video changes that for some of you. Maybe you knew most of this already, and we have just added some details. Maybe you knew none of it, and the picture we have just sketched is going to stay with you for a long time. Whatever the case, you now know something that 20 years ago, almost no one outside a few specialized academic departments knew. You know that beneath the snow and the spruce and the granite of the Canadian Shield, there is a layered world of human history, industrial infrastructure, scientific instrumentation, and deep biology, all of it interlocking and interdependent, all of it operating right now, all of it shaping the future of human knowledge in ways that the rest of the planet is starting to recognize. That is the story of Canada's oldest mines going deeper than anyone expected, and of what is at the bottom. It is not a finished story, it is a story we are still writing. And the next chapter, in all probability, will be more interesting than any of the chapters that have come before. There is one more strand of the story we should weave in before we close, because it has been mostly absent from the popular telling, and it deserves to be heard. The deep mines of northern Ontario and Quebec sit on land that has been the home of First Nations communities since long before European contact. The Wabun Tribal Council, the Mushkegowuk Council, the Nishnawbe-Aski Nation, and the Algonquin communities of the Upper Ottawa Valley have all, in different ways, watched the head frames go up on their traditional territories, and have, in different ways, negotiated, resisted, and adapted to the changes those head frames brought. The early relationship was, by every honest standard, exploitative. The benefits of the mines accrued overwhelmingly to investors in Toronto, Montreal, New York, and London. The costs in disrupted hunting grounds, polluted watercourses, displaced families, and lost language and culture were borne by communities whose voices were almost never heard in the official record. That history cannot be rewritten, and it should not be glossed over. What has changed slowly over the past 3 or 4 decades is the legal and political framework within which new Canadian mines are developed. Impact and benefit agreements, the negotiated arrangements between mining companies and the affected First Nations, are now standard for any new operation in the country. These agreements typically include employment guarantees, training programs, equity participation, environmental monitoring rights, and direct revenue sharing. They are not perfect. The bargaining position of a remote First Nation is rarely equal to that of a multinational mining company, and the implementation of these agreements has been uneven. But the principle has shifted. The land is no longer treated as empty. The communities are no longer treated as invisible. And in some of the more recent Canadian mining developments, including several in the diamond fields of the Northwest Territories and in the new gold projects of the James Bay Lowlands, Indigenous communities have negotiated genuine equity stakes that give them real influence over how the mines operate and how their benefits are distributed. That is a meaningful change, and it is part of what the deep Canadian mining story looks like in this generation. There is also the role of specific individuals whose names do not always make it into the official histories. Noah Timmins, the merchant from Mattawa, whose family financed the Hollinger mine, was a careful, conservative, religious man who built his fortune by patient investment rather than by speculation. The town that carries his name was in its early decades, in some respects, a more orderly and better planned community than its neighbors, because of his personal influence on its development. Joseph Bigwood, the Sudbury hotelier and mine financier, played a similar role in the early days of the Nickel Basin. Henry Pellet, the Toronto industrialist and builder of Casa Loma, lost most of his fortune trying to play in the cobalt-silver game and is a cautionary example of the dangers of late entry into a booming mining camp. There is the story of women in the Canadian deep mining workforce, which begins later than the men's story, but is now an essential part of the operating reality of the industry. Women were almost entirely excluded from underground work in Canadian mines until the 1970s, when changing social attitudes and changing law combined to open the underground workforce to anyone who wanted the job and could pass the qualifications. The first women hoist operators, drill operators, and surveyors faced enormous obstacles, including outright hostility from some of the men they worked alongside. But they persisted, and they trained the women who came after them, and today the underground workforce at every major Canadian mine includes a significant number of women in every job category. The deep mine engineering profession has, in recent years, been led by women in a number of high-profile cases, including some of the operations managers at major Ontario gold mines. The cultural shift is real and it is ongoing, and the working community of the deep mines is more diverse today than it has ever been. There is also the small, quiet story of the retired miners who, late in their lives, have organized themselves into oral history projects, recording their memories of working underground for the archives of regional museums and universities. The Timmins Museum, the Sudbury Mining Heritage Museum, the Cobalt Mining Museum, and the Britannia Mine Museum in British Columbia all hold extensive collections of these recordings. If you want to hear in their own words what it was like to ride down the cage in 1955, or to drive a slusher in 1962, or to swing a jackleg drill at the lakeshore in 1947, the recordings exist, and many of them are available online. They are an extraordinary resource. The men and women who lived this history are nearly gone now, but the recordings remain, and they make the head frames and the shafts and the deep workings more than just abstract industrial spaces. They make them human. Let us close with a few thoughts about what all of this means and where it leaves us. The first thing to say, plainly, is that the men and women who sank these shafts did not know what they were going to find. They were chasing gold. They were chasing nickel. They were chasing copper and silver and zinc. They were chasing wages and futures and the chance to send children to school. The discoveries that have come out of the bottom of those holes in recent decades were not part of anyone's business plan. They are, in a sense, an enormous, unearned scientific dividend that the miners of the 20th century gave to the scientists of the 21st, without ever knowing that they were doing it. Every miner who pushed a wall back a meter at Creighton, every shift boss who signed off on a deeper drill round at Kidd Creek, every engineer who designed a stronger head frame at Macassa was contributing, accidentally and without compensation, to the future possibility of finding the oldest water on Earth, the deepest dark matter, laboratories on the planet, and the answer to one of the great mysteries of solar physics. The men who died in the Hollinger Fire of 1928, the men and women who died in the rock bursts and falls of the years since, were also part of that long accidental contribution. Their work and their sacrifices opened the doorways that the scientists now walk through. The second thing to say is that the story is not by any measure complete. The deep biosphere is barely characterized. We know it exists. We know roughly what it eats. We do not know how much of it there is. We do not know how many distinct microbial lineages live in the deep crust of the Canadian Shield. We do not know whether the organisms we have so far identified are typical of the deep biosphere or are unusual outliers. We do not know how the deep biosphere interacts, if at all, with the shallower biosphere of soils and lakes and forests above it. We don't know whether in the deepest fractures of the Sudbury Basin or the Abitibi Belt there are forms of life that are genuinely different from anything else known on Earth, that have evolved separately for billions of years in their own isolated chemistry. These are open scientific questions, and the only places on this continent where we can hope to answer them are the deep mines of northern Ontario and northwestern Quebec. The third thing to say is that the dark matter problem, which SNOLAB is working on, is not solved. The current generation of experiments has narrowed the parameter space, ruling out many possible candidates, but no detection has yet been made. The next generation of detectors, currently under construction or in the planning phase, will be more sensitive by orders of magnitude. If dark matter exists in the form that most theorists currently expect, those detectors will find it. If they do not find it, the implication will be that dark matter is even stranger than we thought, and the search will continue with yet another generation of instruments. Either way, the work will be done in deep underground laboratories, because that is the only place on Earth where the cosmic ray background is low enough to allow for the necessary measurements, and Canada has one of the best such laboratories anywhere. The fourth thing to say is that the search for life beyond Earth has been changed, possibly permanently, by what was found in a Canadian copper mine. NASA's planning for future Mars missions has explicitly incorporated the lessons of Kidd Creek into its strategy for deep subsurface exploration. The European Space Agency has done likewise. The Chinese space program, the Japanese space program, the Indian space program are all paying attention. If life is ever found on Mars, it will almost certainly be deep underground life, of the kind whose Earth analogs were first characterized in northern Ontario. And the Canadian researchers who did that characterization will be cited in the Discovery Papers. The fifth thing to say is that the question of what to do with these mines, when their ore is exhausted, is genuinely unresolved. There is no national policy in place. There is no clear framework for designating particular mines as scientific infrastructure to be preserved past their economic mining life. There is no fund set aside for the long-term maintenance of underground laboratory facilities. The current arrangement at SNOLAB depends on the ongoing cooperation of a private mining company that, like all private companies, will eventually move on. If we want this country to continue to have access to the deepest places on this continent, we will have to make explicit decisions about how to maintain that access, and we will have to be willing to pay for it. The scientific value of doing so is enormous. The political will to do it is, at the moment, uncertain. That brings us to a question that we will leave with you, because it is genuinely the right question to leave you with. What should Canada do with its deepest holes? Should we preserve them as scientific infrastructure for the next century, accepting the substantial cost and the long-term commitment on the bet that the discoveries to come will be worth it? Or should we let them close, like every mine eventually closes, except that the doorways will quietly swing shut and direct our scientific resources to other projects? Should we be ambitious about this or modest? Should we lead the world in deep underground science or leave that role to other countries with their own deep minds and their own ambitions? There is no obvious right answer. There are serious arguments on both sides. The cost of preserving a deep mine as a research facility for decades after it has stopped paying for itself is real, and the opportunity cost of not spending that money on other scientific priorities is also real. But the unique opportunity that these holes represent, the irreplaceability of the access they provide, the irreversibility of letting them flood, make the decision particularly weighty. We are not talking about a choice that can be easily reversed. Once a deep mine floods, it is, for all practical purposes, gone. So let me know in the comments what you think. Should we preserve these places? Should we let them go? Is there a middle path where we keep some open and close the rest? What is the right framework for thinking about a national asset that is, simultaneously, a piece of industrial history, a working economic resource, a scientific facility of global importance, and a kind of strange sacred space that very few people will ever physically visit? I genuinely want to hear what you think. The comments under this video are going to be a good thread, and I read them. If you have made it this far, thank you. This was a long ride, and you deserve credit for staying with it. If you learned something, share the video with somebody. Send it to a Canadian friend, or to a friend who thinks about science, or to a teacher, or to anyone who appreciates an enormous, sprawling, half-hidden national story. If you have not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button now, because the next few videos on this channel are going to dig into other corners of Canadian history that you have probably never heard about. There are stories about lost northern expeditions, about wartime industrial mobilization, about communities and people whose contributions are nearly invisible in the official record. We will tell them all in turn, and if you ever find yourself driving through northern Ontario or northwestern Quebec on Highway 11 or Highway 144, or the long stretches of road through the Abitibi Belt, look at the head frames that rise on the horizon. They are not just industrial buildings. They are gateways to one of the most remarkable underground worlds on Earth, and to a story that you now know more about than almost anyone you will meet today. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video.